Hey everybody, welcome back to the heart of Sizer Design and Illustration. I'm Paul Sizer, and today's session we're going to be taking a look at more sophisticated form creation. So if you're watching these in order, last time we spoke about just taking simple geometric shapes, squares, circles, triangles, that kind of stuff, and extruding them into three-dimensional forms, cylinders, cubes, and cones, um, building from very, very simple shapes and stacking their shapes, building them dimensionally, and then being able to combine them to make complex forms. So today we're going to take a look at starting off from shapes that aren't as geometric and are a little bit more natural based, and how to extrude those, or how to think about those as shapes that can become dimensional, that can have a three-dimensional volume and depth to them, and how they're going to combine to create more complex forms. So with all of these tutorials, again, I'm going to be showing you digitally using combinations of Photoshop, Manga Studio, and Clip Studio Paint. But you following along and doing this stuff is not dependent on you having any of this technology. The only technology you would need to have is just paper and pencil, something that makes a mark and something that you can mark on. So please feel free as you're watching this, have a piece of paper with you, have a pencil in your hand, try these things out that I'm doing, draw along with, and then also practice the stuff when the video is finished. So again, the idea behind this is that these are ways that an artist breaks down complex forms into simple shapes and then allows those simple shapes to be adaptable so that you're able to draw things that can maybe start out with having a visual reference, but then starting out and with that visual reference and then being able to build from that. So in the last video we spoke a little bit about just, again, taking simple shapes, spheres, cylinders, cubes, and that kind of stuff, and combining them into forms. And because we're able to build those shapes with the component forms that create them, that means that you can adapt and you can change them. So in today's tutorial, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about how we can create forms that are less geometric or maybe less regular shape forms, but they're shapes that would then be able to be adapted or be converted into a three-dimensional form. So let's start out. Again, I'll be working in the red pencil layer here just so it's easier to see and to differentiate, but I'm going to be sketching. As with all the sketching stuff that I do, don't worry too much as you're sketching. This is not meant to be perfect. These are the building blocks. This is the foundational stuff that you're going to be doing. So don't freak out if you're not drawing perfect, beautiful final lines with this stuff. It's meant to be sketching. It's meant to be trying a bunch of different ideas, auditioning stuff, seeing what works, what doesn't work, changing your mind, adding things, and being adaptable. So as with a lot of artists, probably the best place that you can look for how to build forms is looking at nature, looking at things around you, but nature and the engineering that goes into natural forms, to animals, to plants, to biological forms, to things that are geographical rocks, formations that happen and occur in nature, in cell structures. That kind of stuff is great for artists to be able to look at. Me personally, I love looking at things like insects. The way that insects and animals are engineered is amazing. Looking at the biological engineering that goes into how bodies, how skeletons, how organs, how different, just the building blocks of how things in nature are built are terrific ways to start out with kind of thinking about how you can build customizable things for you. And you can always mechanize them. You can always turn them into from something that might be made out of cellular tissue or something like that, or a natural substance can always be extrapolated and turned into something that might be made out of plastic or metal or some inorganic kind of a component. So, it's just a starting point. But again, artists will tend to always kind of take a look at things and break them down. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. So let's go ahead and I'm going to start drawing and just start talking about this. So like I said, I love taking a look at things like insects, the way that insects are built. And when we take a look at the raw components of, say, like how a beetle is made, one of my favorite things. And if you seriously go and just, if you have a chance to take a look at like close-up shots of insects, close-up shots of beetles and mosquitoes and bees and all that kind of stuff, you're not going to be able to find a better biological starting point for drawing the best monsters, the best armor, that kind of stuff. It's all built with that. Land creatures, sea creatures. I love sea creatures. I love building things as from both hard shell crustaceans and things like that, but also soft shell things. I love mollusks. I love octopuses and squids and cephalopods and animals of that genus and species who are built out of soft things, but that they have all these really cool things. So when you're starting to talk about forms, like we talked about in the last video, part of what a form is that we're thinking about the surface being dimensional. So I'm going to just kind of draw a shape here just to kind of get us started. So if I have this kind of amorphous shape here, I mean it's like a kind of a pinched ellipse shape, kind of an oval, but kind of comes to the idea here. We're looking at this, and without any other reference on it, this looks relatively flat. There's really not anything to indicate to us that this has any dimension, that it has any three-dimensional feel, that it has any volume to it. So part of the way that we can show dimension and the ways that we can show volume within a form is to give visual clues that a surface is not flat to us. So for instance, if I wanted to draw lines across this, like kind of segment it, if I draw just kind of straight lines like this that are kind of parallel and just relatively straight up to top, those flat lines there flatten this entire shape out. It makes it look like it's just one-dimensional. They're going from top to bottom. There's no variation. They're parallel to one another. And everything about this kind of flattens that shape out. So let me do a few undos here. Now, look at the difference that this happens if I put curved lines on this shape. And again, they're still going to be relatively parallel to one another. But as I kind of go through here, just even very simply, by having those curved lines on there, now, rather than being a flat shape, this is a shape that's curving perhaps towards you. What I call it, these lines are mapping a surface. They are mapping along a curved surface, whereas those first lines were mapping across a flat surface. So anything that I'm doing within this shape that gives a visual clue that this is not a flat surface is going to give it a more volumetric feel. And then in conjunction with the fact that this shape around here is no longer, it's not a perpendicular flat line, it's a curved line. Now all of these lines together are beginning to give you visual clues. And that's what an artist is meant to do, is that when you're drawing stuff like this, you are still technically drawing, two-dimensional work, but you're using visual tricks to imply or to suggest dimensional feel to things. So let me go ahead and get rid of those lines. So in that same way, I have a great deal of flexibility of being able to map lines, like those simple curved lines show that form to be just uniformly curvilinear on the front edge of it. But if it's something where if I went like this, and then again, the same kind of thing, even those lines are showing that there's a curvilinear aspect to it, but that there's something happening down here. And actually what this is kind of inferring is that if I make kind of a connector line between those, now we've just made that shape a little bit more complex, meaning that it curves a certain way here to this point, but that this curve here is a slightly different one. So this is sort of like a top edge, and then this is a kind of a bottom lip along the edge here that's different. So again, I'm doing things that are, again, giving visual clues as to what the surface is doing, even though it's just two-dimensional. I'm able to give clues that show what the three-dimensional idea that I want to get across here. So, and again, this, as we're taking a look at this, I can kind of segment this, and this might be something that, again, like a turtle shell, as I started drawing that, it started looking the same way that we kind of see like that a turtle's shell is kind of has segments like that. And again, each one of these lines that I'm drawing, as I'm mapping the surface, it's agreeing with the other lines here, meaning that even though these lines aren't exactly the same, they all kind of visually agree that they are following a variation of the arc of the top here, or the arc of the bottom here. So you see that these lines are kind of mimicking this down here. These lines are kind of mimicking here. And what we're taking a look at here is that me taking a look at this, if we're sort of seeing this like, and I'm going to draw just a kind of a line here. If this is sort of the center line, if this is like our eye line, like if we're looking at this with our eye, there's mine, put some eyelashes on it. That this is kind of looking at it straight on, like 100% perpendicular to your plane of vision. So anything that is above that plane of vision that goes from straight and slightly up, these lines here are curving up. They're curving away and referring to this edge. Any of the lines here that are below my eye line, below that eye line, are kind of agreeing and mapping more to this edge here. So again, I'm able to use these lines to show how a surface is behaving, or to give clues to how a surface is behaving. All right, so let's go ahead and clear that off. So as I'm beginning to build different types of forms, any form that I build, or any form that I kind of think about, I can kind of, again, use basic shapes, do a little bit of extrusion, and then map lines to that form to give an idea of how it's going to look. So we did kind of an organic turtle shell right there. I'm going to do something that'll be a little bit more hard edge. So think of this as something that maybe that's built out of metal or plastic. So I'm going to just start out with just some base shapes. And as I say, anytime that I get away from absolutely straight lines and do curved lines can still imply that it's a straight edge, but that I'm seeing it in dimensional space. I'm seeing it three-dimensionally. So if I draw, say, like a form like this, sort of a modified triangle, this, in fact, could be, when we look at it straight, might be a triangle that looks like this. But that what I've done is I've taken that flat triangle and I've moved it into dimensional space. So I'm twisting it, I'm turning it, I'm moving it on that z-axis and putting it into perspective. So in the same way, and I'll kind of draw these like concurrently, because I think this would be actually a good way to think about this. So if I have this triangle shape here, and let's say that this is maybe like, I think when I started off, I wanted to think about this as maybe like being a piece, like a part of armor, like maybe a shoulder shield or something like that. So if I'm thinking about this this shoulder shield on a piece of armor that might be on a piece like on I don't know, somebody's armor, Iron Man's armor, whatever. If I'm looking at things like this and saying, well, I have this shape here, and I'm going to have these lines that come around and go here, and then in the center of that shape, I have a circular form. So this is looking at it 100% straight on, so it's flat. There's no real like dimensional look. This is looking at something straight on, like kind of silhouette. But this shape here is something that's in dimension. That's actually kind of in 3D space, and that's wrapping around a larger form. So because this has curvilinear shapes here, the same way, if I wanted to kind of replicate what I've got here as a starting point, rather than having flat lines on this, I'm going to contour these lines. So if I wanted to divide this up, I'm going to contour this line to go, say, like from here to here as a curved line. And let me try that one more time here. There we go. And this circle shape that I have is going to be in perspective. So I'm going to draw that more as a ellipse shape, of an oblong shape. So I'm going to kind of just put that in there. So in that same way, I've taken the basic flat information here and I've put this into a dimensional field, into a dimensional 3D field, so that this is still the same information. I'm still looking at a triangle with a stripe and a circle on it. This one is flat, this one is in dimensional 3D space. So all of the lines that are going here, these curved lines on this surface, are agreeing with the curve of this surface here in relationship to one another. The way that this circle is now an oblong is agreeing with how it's laying on the surface of this. So this has a feel of being dimensional and wrapping around something. So in that same way, and I'm going to kind of, this is kind of clean, but I'm going to go kind of do the shape extrusion and kind of say like if this would be attached to an arm, something like this where we have armor that's wrapping around. I'm going to kind of draw the base arm that's beneath this. So this will give me a few seconds here. So there's the elbow, and let's kind of just extrude that down here. I'll talk a little bit more about how I'm extruding these forms in just a second, but as I talked about in the last video, when you're sketching, you're not worried about this being perfect. This is laying down the foundational work. It's laying down the base idea for how shapes are going to go, and you're doing this because you know you're going to go in and make alterations and changes to it. So for instance, I know for sure that I'm going to be making changes to how this looks, and so I'm not too worried right now initially about extra lines or guidelines or lines that I'm using to kind of fill this out, to build this around. There's lots of lines here that aren't going to be used. That doesn't make a difference. But as we're taking a look at this, I can kind of see that in the same way that if I want to keep adding things to this, like for instance, another shape or another portion of this armor, let's say it's kind of a stacked stack of triangles that lives on this shoulder pad here. Same thing is that if I want this to continue to wrap around this arm, why don't I do this up here? And I might kind of just take this down. Kind of like that. I'm going to make kind of an area here where the elbow, where the bend point would be. So I'm going to draw with just slightly heavier lines just to kind of indicate the shapes that I want to actually be my final shapes. Just to sort of differentiate them from my sketching wireframes that live beneath. So once again, while I'm taking a look at this, I'm making sure that the lines that I have laying against these they're kind of agreeing with the surface that they're laying on. So again, if this is sort of a flat shield and then beneath it is kind of a segmented kind of armor that lives beneath it, the segments, the lines that are dividing it up are slightly curved to kind of mimic either the line up here in the same way that this top triangle lines this. And same thing with this arm. The arm that exists here, again, if this is kind of like a segmented armor, the lines that are on here are curvilinear because they're wrapping around that form. They are mapping to the dimensional form that's beneath it. So here's another thing too. This is a flat circle. Would it be kind of cool if that was actually like a spike? So again, let's go ahead and extrude that. We'll make it actually a pretty big spike. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a point out here let's have that spike kind of extend out, and that circle now becomes the basis for a cone shape or a spike. And yeah, that's such a good idea. Let's go ahead and put a few spikes on there. Let's make this some nasty, cool armor. Same thing. So I'm just going to kind of use that as a starting point. Have those come to another cone there. Perfect. All right. Let's get those extra lines out of there. Move that out. All right. Same thing. Let's just go ahead and get those extra lines out of the way. All right. So now we've got spiked armor. This is starting to get cooler as we start taking a look at this. Same way. Let's talk about, again, we're going to map. Let's actually give this guy some spikes on his elbow for, like, being able to get people that way. Same thing here is that I'm going to take a look at this. We've got the band that is wrapping around his elbow area, his bend area here, so it's going to be somewhat flexible. But I'm going to have it so that it's also a protective thing, so it'll be like a solid sleeve around there. But let's go ahead and I'm going to map some circles along that. And you can see I changed this one that's beginning to curve away. These that are a little bit more at eye level are kind of close and more circular. But as I am getting away from you, as it's wrapping around, this is more of an ellipse because we're not seeing it flat, we're seeing it as it begins to turn away from you into perspective. So in that same way here, let's, again, I'm just sort of like mapping these spikes out. And I'm taking a look at, like, saying, if these are wrapping around his circular, the cylinder of his arm, they're going to be going out in kind of various directions. So as I'm taking a look at this spike is going to kind of go out this way, this spike is going to go this way, this spike is going to go this way. So I'm using, let me go ahead and alter this one here because that actually looks like it's pointing down. Let's kind of figure that out a little more precisely. I can use these lines because, again, I'm all these lines. If it's if there's kind of a cylinder that arm is built off of, these lines are going to indicate from the center of that circle out. So, yeah, that looks better. So that spike would go there. That spike would go there. That spike would kind of go there. Again, let's go ahead and get rid of some of those interior construction lines that we wouldn't see, that are kind of hidden. All right. Wow, this is looking more and more like a heavy metal album cover by the minute. All right, cool. So I talked about this, and I wanted to I wanted to kind of talk about this too. I did this kind of quickly, but the idea that we're taking and doing biological forms of extrusion. We've talked about this before, where we've done things where we've had a circle or a square or a triangle and extruded those into geometric forms. But the way that we do things with the human body, or things that have skeletons or an infrastructure or internal structure, is that we extrude things, but sort of starting from a center point out. So what I'll explain with this is that this is the way that I always tell people that they can do things from stick figures, that they can start drawing things from stick figures. So if we think of the bones in your body as kind of like a stick figure that your body is built around, the same thing is that I would start out, and with a stick figure on this arm, I would create this. So again, here's my bend point. Here is, there's the shoulder. There's the elbow, and then say the wrist is down here. So if this is your skeleton, if this is the infrastructure of these forms, the way that I can create a dimensional feel about this is rather than doing straight lines, rather than just turning these into cylinders, I'm going to change them into what I would call like a biological cylinder, meaning that I could start out with having forms and shapes that are informed by the human body, like bigger circles and these kinds of things, and then begin to connect these things and extrude them, but to also be thinking about the fact that if I'm growing these kind of from the center out, expanding out like this, that in the same way is that I'm thinking about these, is that these shapes are starting from the center as a radius and going out here. So if I was to think about this, actually I'm extruding this as a shape, and it's a combination of a bunch of changing shape ellipses that all have a common center point here, or at least a basic center point. Excuse me. So in the same way, if I went kind of with that logic here, is that if I wanted to, I'm going to use, say, like this line here to be my center point. If I had a bunch of shapes like this, just kind of combining those, I'm extruding this shape. I'm doing it in a slightly less geometric way, but I'm doing it in the same way that kind of your body. If you think of like your skeleton, excuse me. If your skeleton is that center stick figure, then around that stick figure is wrapped muscles, blood, organs, skin, fur, whatever. And that you are building from the inside out. So in that same way, we're building that, and these are giving us the clues of how this shape is, how this form is actually contoured. So again, since we built this from these ovals, from these ellipse shapes that are here, that's giving us the visual clues that I was using here as far as the wrapping of these forms around this base shape here. So in that same way, I've got my bend point. So again, if I was thinking about this as armor that's wrapping around, in the same, the same basic idea that I did over there, but I'm just sort of showing you a little bit more from the ground up of how I'm doing that stuff, and seeing the base shape. And that's why I think it's important as an artist to learn how to draw things like this, understanding the underlying superstructure of them. Because with this, it's, I can take a look at this and make the decisions about how this needs to go. And I already have my guidelines here for knowing the geometrics of, here's stuff that's going to taper around this arm. And I already know it because I can see the underlying superstructure of those ellipses that made it. So it's less a guessing game. You're basing things more on the base form of things. So in that same way, how is stuff going to wrap on the forearm here? Well, I've got these shapes and forms. I know that this is the closer part of that ellipse, so that I'm going to make these forms follow that logic there. All right. So yeah, it was kind of like a backward way to do it, but on the other hand, I like seeing how somebody's done something, but I think it's equally valuable to also to be able to kind of go and kind of like retro engineer it, to kind of reverse engineer how you get something, and you can see the logic. So this kind of stuff is stuff that, because I've done this for so long and because I've practiced a lot, I'm able to understand this kind of stuff and mentally just sort of fill in the blanks. But if you're learning, or as you're learning, I think it's a good idea for any artist to kind of check themselves on this kind of stuff and to be able to look at these forms and understand how these forms wrap together and how they build together and how they overlap, and that the internal logic usually is right there for you. You don't have to invent it. The internal logic is going to always be suggested by the geometry that is in there, even if it's very organic geometry. So yeah, that's kind of the same thing here. And when you begin to look at this stuff, like I said, learning from nature is always really important. But knowing that nature is kind of engineered in a way that lets things combine together to work, as far as like being a biological machine. That's the same way that, like, as I just put this line here, it kind of reminded me, like, that's the way that muscles um, lay next to one another and lay across one another and lay side by side with one another in your body. So as I'm starting to take a look at this, if I was adding musculature or kind of that kind of stuff to this armor form, if it's meant to sort of mimic the way that the human body is, I might go in and again map my lines a little bit differently based on these forms that exist in here. So I'm going to just sort of erase some of these away and do a little bit of refinement in the sketching stage. And again, this is why pencils have erasers. This is something that, again, an idea has come up, and I'm able to alter it in the sketch phase, so that I'm not so worried about trying to draw this thing perfectly right from the get-go. I'm able to go in and make decisions and change things as ideas come to me or as they present themselves. So in that same way here, if I've got, say we've got the metallic armor that's up here, but if these are kind of like wrapped muscles that are kind of wrapped maybe in kind of like armor, segmented armor type stuff, I can go here, and each one of these shapes kind of has its own internal logic as far as how those forms would wrap. So the curved lines that are here are implying the dimensional feel of that. I think these would probably kind of have a little bit of a feel like that, perhaps. And again, I'm mapping, these curved lines are mapping the surface, and they're giving me information about how that surface is mapping to the base surface that it's laying on. So I didn't put the spikes on here, but so if we got, again, if we like kind of, let's go ahead and get rid of some of this other extraneous stuff that we're looking at here. Yeah. There we go, cones. So, I say this a million times. I think that one of the things that I see people kind of trip up a lot on is that when they begin drawing, they are so worried about having the first line that goes down be the perfect line that they kind of get held up from actually experimenting or really taking a look at how something is drawn or having a better second idea. Sometimes the first idea that you have is going to be something that's going to be the great idea, but that doesn't happen very often. And honestly, a lot of my best ideas are things that come from me just giving myself permission to be able to kind of screw around a little bit. And that's kind of what we've seen here is that, for instance, as I started this out, this drawing is okay, but this drawing has a lot more kind of interesting nuance in it because I kind of built it a little bit more methodically than this. I did this one okay. This one I really kind of, I saw some potential in this, and I kind of zeroed in and had a little bit more potential with this one. This to me has a lot more kind of integrity as far as the build and a little bit more integrity as far as the logic that is in these forms, that they have a like agreed upon look of how they feel dimensional, and the visual clues that I'm building in to make them feel dimensional. So, I think that give yourself the permission to be able to take a look at those two things, to be able to start out with an idea and then go ahead and move ahead to another idea that's maybe a little bit more refined. It doesn't have to be perfect out of the gate. And like I said, spoiler alert, it probably never is. Unless you are an absolute super genius or an absolute master, the first line out of your pencil is not going to be perfect. And even if it is, give yourself the opportunity to kind of try other ideas out. Sketching is meant to be a lot of screw-ups that lead you to a cooler idea. So take the time and mess around with that. Give yourself the opportunity to play. Give yourself the opportunity to play long enough that you kind of exhaust boring ideas and get to the interesting stuff, the stuff that's more unique. So you're not just kind of, barfing up the first thing that comes out of your head. Give yourself a chance to kind of warm up. Think about it like in the same way that you would warm up before you do a long run. Take the time to stretch. So if this was more like me kind of stretching and planning some stuff out, this is once I'm warmed up and I'm getting way better results. I'm getting way more interesting stuff that's showing more data, showing more information about these forms, that's showing things that are way more interesting and have a little bit more of a foundational feel to them, that are better refined. So I would say go ahead and for your assignment from this tutorial is try and replicate something from nature. Take a look at, as I began in the beginning of this video, find some time and take a look at some biological engineering. Take a look at bugs. Take a look at animals. Take a look at fish. Take a look at weird things that live really deep in the ocean, and start to, again, break them down into their component shapes. Break them down into things that you can kind of rebuild a portion of that animal, a portion of that bug, a portion of that cephalopod, whatever. I mean, but see about a way that you can use this kind of form building to create something that's starts out from a biological start, and mess around with these kinds of shapes. So again, the end result of this was a lot of biological forms, but also back to things like cones and cubes and spheres and that kind of stuff as well. So it's always going to be a combination. But find something that you like, and I would say find something that's biological. Find something that's an animal or an animal, insect, bird, whatever, and find a way to draw it, and then find some ways to modify it and kind of make it cooler, make it something that's customized. So you started off with this animal, and then you kind of extrapolate it into something that's cooler than that animal, or sort of like ultimate version of that animal, and try that out. So, yeah. All right, well, good. I think that's a good stopping point for today. Again, if you have questions about stuff that I've done, feel free to leave them in the comments, or talk to me in email, or just bring it up in class if we're doing this in a class. So once again, this is Paul Sizer. Thank you very much for drawing with me today. Draw every day. Draw cool things. Always draw. And I will see you soon. All right? Take it easy. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.